webinar, and I was grateful to be able to look at the list of attendees and see that there were so many people from different states as well as many people from New Jersey. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about, obviously, the strike team and how we function as a cooperative weed management area and some of the things that we do here in New Jersey, and then I'll give a little bit of information on some of the species that we target and how we choose them and so forth. And so as Steve said, please do feel free to send in questions either during the webinar or at the end, at the end once we sign off. My email there is on the screen, melissa@njisst.org. I do encourage you to please reach out and contact me and send any questions you might have. So with that, I will get started. As Steve said, my name is Melissa Almendinger. I'm the Education Director for the New Jersey Invasive Species Strike Team. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so we do not receive any government money, which is, I guess, why I'm able to be here today. It's obviously difficult because we do not receive any public money, but so we have to raise all our own funding. But in that respect, we do have a lot of freedom with what we want to do and how we want to do it, which is sort of a blessing in disguise. So I wanted to recognize the funders that are here up on the screen. We've raised over $600,000 in grant money since we began back in 2008. And actually just recently we received two really exciting grants, one from the U.S. Forest Service for $127,000 and one from the Natural Resource Conservation Service for $43,000. And those are both federal sources of money which we've not received before. So we're really excited to get them. We are looking for match money. All federal money requires a one-to-one match. So if any of you are interested in getting involved as a donor or a member, we'd love to have you join our efforts. As of right now, we have about 80 current members, both individuals and organizations, and we encourage as many people as are interested to join in as a member of the strike team. So I'll begin by talking about what an invasive species is for those of you that are unsure of the specific definition. An invasive species, first of all, is a living organism that is non-native to the area in question. In my case, we're looking at New Jersey, and non-native being that it wasn't here at the time that colonization started happening. So it was before people started bringing over creatures. Beyond the fact that it's non-native is what it does once it gets here. So there's lots and lots of species that are non-native to New Jersey, but not all of them are considered invasive. So what makes them invasive is the way that they behave. They have negative impacts on other species, and that results in a general reduction in biodiversity and an interruption of basically the function of an ecosystem. What we like to tell people is, we try to fight against invasive species not because of what we know, but because of what we don't know. We do not know, all the inner workings of an ecosystem, and we don't know how these invasive organisms that are coming in are going to, we don't know the full impact that they're going to have. Since they are not from here, they do not have natural predators or natural systems such as, fungus and pathogens and weather or soil properties that might keep them under control, and so therefore they start to grow very, very aggressively. This picture in the background was taken in central New Jersey in Burlington County, and that is all English ivy, a very popular landscape plant, and it is spreading, and once it gets into a forested system, as in the picture, it behaves extremely aggressively, and as you can see, can pretty much form a carpet, excluding all other native species from the base of this particular forest, and that we'd be very concerned about. We don't really know, what's going to happen over the next few years without smaller young plants coming in and growing and taking over. We don't know what that's going to lead to. It's important to remember that invasive species, I talk a lot about plants because I do a lot of outreach programs to the public, and that's what the public is mostly familiar with. But invasive species are across all taxa. They can be birds, insects, pathogens, amphibians. We have a couple mammals. So they spread far and wide, but they all behave in the same general way, which is once they're introduced, to behave aggressively and impact all the other species that are in that ecosystem. So then what are they actually doing? We know they're spreading, but why is that a bad thing? And especially in the case of plants, it may be a little bit elusive because people may say, well, green, it's good, it's, it's giving oxygen, it's holding the soil in place. And those things might be a little bit true, but they certainly do have much more harmful qualities than they do positive benefits. And I wanted to go through a couple examples. So this photograph teaches us about the American chestnut tree, which many of you, I hope, are familiar with. The American chestnut tree was one of the most important trees in the eastern hardwood forest, making up about 25% of the understory. Mature trees grew to be 600 years old and 80 to 100 feet tall. They were one of the most important wildlife foods at the turn of the 20th century, feeding creatures such as bear, deer, turkey, squirrels, birds, even the infamous, or the famous, I should say, passenger pigeon. So what happened around the 1900s, chestnut blight was discovered. It was discovered actually in New York City in 1904, and it's caused by a fungus that came in on some Asian nursery stock. And again, once the fungus got here, our chestnut trees had no real defenses against it, and it was able to spread very quickly. And by 1940, about 3.5 billion trees had succumbed to this blight. And now we are pretty much devoid of American chestnut trees in our forests. If we find them, it's a very exciting thing. Most of them are seedlings, and eventually they probably too will succumb to the blight. There's a lot of research being done on different hybrids and things like that, but the American chestnut tree as we once knew it is pretty much no longer in existence. And so that's kind of a harsh lesson, and it teaches us a couple of things. That number one, invasive species can have very significant, devastating results that change, obviously, entire ecosystems, entire, almost, half of our continent that it impacted. And it was brought here because we were importing non-native landscape plants. So this teaches us, a couple of things, that not only the plants that we're bringing in might be harmful, but what they are harboring, whether it's an insect larva or a fungus, such as the case of American chestnut. Here's another picture. This is actually just came through my email a couple of days ago. This picture was taken in South Jersey. And this is actually two plants that are spreading here. If you recognize either of them, I have them circled in yellow and then an enlargement in the upper right corner. One of them is kudzu vine and the other is mile-a-minute. And both of these plants are well-known, very aggressive invaders. Kudzu is less well recognized in New Jersey. We tend to think of it as more of a southern weed, but clearly it is in New Jersey and it is spreading quite vigorously. This picture is sort of both of these invasive plants competing with one another, so it's an interesting scenario to think, I wonder which one will win. But what you want to think about when you look at a picture like this is not what we see, but what do we not see? We don't see any native grasses. We don't see any young trees or any shrubs. I can't even really tell what sort of habitat this is supposed to be. I see there's trees on the edge. Maybe this is a power line cut, I'm not sure, but obviously this is having impacts on the native vegetation that belong here, and then obviously it's having effects on the animals that rely on that native vegetation, whether for food or shelter, breeding zones. This has especially important impacts on insects. Insects are very specific feeders. They only recognize certain vegetation as a food source. And so there's been documentation of caterpillars and other insects crawling across, Japanese honeysuckle or whatever it is, literally just not recognizing it as a food source because it's looking for that native plant that it relies on. So these situations can be devastating. The insects form the base of the food chain. So we don't really know what happens as we move up that food chain. Aquatic invasions are also a huge problem. It's a different sort of impacts that they form. This is a plant called water chestnut. which is not related to the water chestnut that you eat in Chinese food. It's a totally different species, but it's an aquatic invader. It sits on the surface of the water and forms little rosettes. But if you can see this entire pond, the piece that's covered by the water chestnut, what's happening is the water chestnut is blocking all the sunlight out from below the water. So therefore, any plants that are growing under the water are not able to photosynthesize, and then they die. And without underwater plants, the oxygen levels will start to decrease in the water. And then we have creatures that are dying off, such as fish, because there's not enough oxygen down there. So we're having this really obvious impact on this ecosystem. And then also there's the impact on recreation. And a lot of lake communities are recognizing some of these aquatic invaders as being significant impacts on real estate, which is an interesting spin. But I figure whatever gets the job done, whatever helps people recognize the threats of these plants, we'll take it and we'll go there and we'll scoop out the water chestnut if they want us to do that. So globally, there's lots of studies going on biodiversity and changes in biodiversity. And the number one threat is usually cited as being habitat destruction. So that is, company comes in, there's a forest, they cut it down, and now there's a subdivision or a strip mall. And that's really obvious that not a lot of animals and native vegetation are utilizing sites like this. Lawn is pretty much, the best it gets, and that's relatively devoid in benefits for wildlife. The interesting thing is that the number 2 threat to biodiversity globally is considered invasive species. And this is a little bit more difficult for the average passerby to see because, again, the green, it's good. It looks very lush, but it is not. This picture is taken in South Jersey. It's a picture of porcelainberry and Japanese clematis, another sort of invasive plant duel going on here. Hard to tell really what they're covering up. But clearly, those trees, I think that they're trees, are no longer surviving. And so all the benefits that the trees would provide, and then anything that tries to grow really is not able to grow through this thicket of clematis and porcelainberry. So we're having this drastic reduction globally of biodiversity as these species spread across not only our continent, but across the globe. Okay, so cooperative weed management, or we talk about cooperative weed management areas. Sometimes they're called cooperative invasive species management areas. What are they? I wanted to give a quick definition. So CWMAs, the definition is they are local organizations that bring together landowners and land managers to coordinate action and share expertise and resources to manage common weed species. So in New Jersey, the New Jersey Invasive Species Strike Team is our cooperative weed management area. There's only one of us, and we function across the entire state. And that is really important because of the fact that in New Jersey, we have a lot of separate land managers. We have the state parks, we have a county park system, we have tremendous amount of watershed associations and land trusts and nonprofit organizations, all managing small, sometimes large, but a lot of times smaller tracts of preserved space. And what was happening is that these groups, although they were managing their own invasive species, were not sharing information with other organizations, and they also were not speaking to all the private land that was in between, separating them. And so we formed the strike team to try to coordinate the cooperation, to coordinate sharing those ideas and resources. And it was met with great enthusiasm from our partners here in New Jersey. They were looking for a way to make this task a little bit easier and to share information. So with that, we started out actually in 2008 as the Central Jersey Invasive Species Strike Team, and we were trying to test out this idea of cooperative weed management. And then by 2011, when it was clear that there was a need for our role and that the public sector was not able to provide it at the time due to budget constraints, we decided to not only expand statewide, but also to go to the IRS and actually form our own nonprofit organization. Our mission is to prevent the spread of emerging invasive species across the state of New Jersey. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about what emerging means in that definition. We are our first and only cooperative weed management area in the state, and we have over 100 partners from all of those different groups that I mentioned, plus foresters and nurseries are starting to get on board now, especially now that we have this U.S. Forest Service grant. And as I mentioned, we are a member and grant-supported organization. So I encourage you all after today's webinar to please visit our website, www.njissc.org. It has a tremendous amount of information, and we are always updating and adding new things. So if there's something that you think you would love to see on our website, please do let me know, and we can get it up there. So here's our lovely state of New Jersey. It's approximately divided into 3 regions, a north, a central, and a south. But you know, in the long run, we anticipate maybe, or we hope to have some staff in the north, central, and south region. Right now, we have just a very small staff of 2 staff members and plus some consultants that help us out. So someday, hopefully, we'll be able to spread ourselves out. But right now, we travel a lot is how we do it. We have 3 goals. The first is to serve as the data clearinghouse for all invasive species in New Jersey. And we are not there yet. So if you go to our website, there is a map where you can click on different regions of New Jersey, whether they be different counties or towns or properties. It does not have all the invasive species data. I won't pretend that it does. One of the great things about the U.S. Forest Service grant that we're working on is it will give us some funding to actually coordinate with other data holders in the state and in the region to get New Jersey's data onto our database. So right now, if you wanted to learn about insects or pathogens, they're not on our website. We have a lot of plant data. We'd like to get it all into one place, basically as an outreach tool. So if you're a land manager, you can go to the database, you can go to the map, I'm sorry, click on your region and learn about the threats that are in your town and county, and then prepare yourself. So you know what's threatening. You can now learn to identify it. You can search around for it. If you have it, there'd be information on other people that are controlling it, so you can reach out to them or directly to the strike team. So it's really a method to get that information out to property owners and then also to help them manage these problems on their property. Our second goal is to assist landowners in detecting and eradicating these threats, and many times this is through pictures. People will send an email, I found this, what is it? We can circulate it around and try to identify the species. If appropriate and if there's funding, and we have done this in the past, we've actually gone out and worked directly with landowners. We've had some field stewards in the past that have done a tremendous amount of field work for our partners. And at the moment, we don't have our field stewards anymore, but we are working on assisting, even if it's just by giving the specific recommendations. We also have worked with property managers, especially nonprofit groups. If they're applying for a grant, they can write us into that grant as the assistant on invasive control, and then we can help in that way. So there's a lot of ways to get the work done. We just have to sometimes be a little bit creative. And then our third goal is education, to encourage the voluntary restrictions on invasive species. So in New Jersey, we do not have a specific state list. We do not have any legislation revolving on what's allowed to be sold and what we can plant and what we can't. We do have a few towns that are adopting ordinances, and we're working on trying to encourage other towns to do that. But as far as the state is concerned, anyone can buy whatever they want. So many of our education programs focus on educating people on the landscape perspective of invasive species and which plants they should avoid. And we have partnered with Native Plant Society and other groups such as that on encouraging the native alternatives to some of these invasive landscape species. On our website, we do have a do not plant list. It is not enforced by the government. It's just something that we put together that we encourage people to bring to the garden centers with them. So if you're interested in that, you can download that right off the homepage of our website. It's called our Do Not Plant List. Some of the challenges that we've experienced in forming this cooperative weed management area, obviously, is funding. We do not have any funding, and there are times when we didn't know if we were going to be in existence for the next week. And then luckily, a large grant always seems to make its way through at the very last moment. But that is one of the challenges, and the large project area, as I mentioned, because of the fact that we have such a long, narrow state. Traveling around is a little bit cumbersome, and being that we only have one office and one base for our outreach supplies, that gets a little cumbersome too. So we're working on ways around that and to try to figure out a way that we can have volunteers in different areas of the state. And we do have a program next week coming up, training volunteers if they'd like to be involved. So if you're one of our New Jersey residents and you're interested in attending that, please check our website for more information on that program. Some of the successes, I would state that a success is funding, even though it's also a challenge because we've been so successful at raising grant money. And then crossing property boundaries, that was one of the things that we thought would be challenging, but actually landowners are more than happy to have us come on their property, especially if we come armed with training materials or especially herbicide, and we're going to treat their invasive plants for them. We have in our database over 540,000 acres have been surveyed with over 1,700 eradications that have been completed. And we're by no means finished with that work, but we have made a great progress in the couple years that we've existed. So I talked about in our mission statement that we focus on emerging invasive species. So basically we've defined some invasive species as being widespread, and these are things like gypsy moth or multiflora rose or Japanese knotweed, things that pretty much everyone has, and they're well beyond the confines of our state. And then we have another list called our emerging invasive species, and those are the ones that we do not see as often. Maybe they're not even in New Jersey in some cases. They're in some of our bordering states. Or they may be something like kudzu, which is clearly very invasive in the south, but not quite getting that strong of a foothold yet in New Jersey. So it ranges from all the way from stage 0 to stage 3, varying in the density of the plants that we've, or the species that we've found. And again, you can check out our website to see which species we're defining as emerging and widespread. You can download all of those lists. But there's about 100-something emerging and another 40 or 50 that are widespread. So this process called early detection and rapid response is the idea where we're finding a species when it's early on in its invasion, and we're rapidly responding to it to prevent it from getting too widespread. So if you see this picture is of a plant called Chinese silvergrass, which is a very popular landscape plant here in New Jersey. It has a lovely fountain quality that people seem to be attracted to. We found one Chinese silvergrass in this meadow here pictured on the top left, and we eradicated it very quickly. We were able to actually go back that very day and get rid of it, prevent all those little fluffy seeds from spreading across this entire meadow. So again, early detection, rapid response. We'll then prevent it from becoming that picture on the bottom right, which is also Chinese silvergrass. That photograph was taken in North Carolina, where Chinese silvergrass is more of a roadside weed, and it is clearly overtaking large swaths of property. We don't want that to happen here in New Jersey with this plant or other plants that are emerging. So we're trying to educate our partners on identification so they can find it quickly and they can know that it is invasive, because a lot of times if you're only seeing one, you might not recognize it as being an invasive species. So our large function of our organization is education and training, whether they be training volunteers or field stewards or interns or staff on the threats that are local to their property so that they know how to identify things quickly, and then we give them the tools for how to eradicate them quickly. We do a lot of data collection. As I said, that was one of our goals, is to serve as a statewide data clearinghouse. So in the past, and actually right now, it involves going out into the field with a data sheet. This is a little piece of our field data sheet. You need a GPS unit, you need a pencil, you need a camera, and then once you're done collecting your data, it involves coming back to the office and sitting down and typing all of that information into a spreadsheet and then sending it off. A lot of times there are errors, so it involves some communication back and forth. In short, it's a little bit cumbersome, but it's the way that we've been functioning, and we've had some really successful data submissions from our partners and from internally, and it's been going great. However, we recognize that the average person even if they're a field steward that's doing this for a living or if they're a volunteer, is not necessarily walking around with a GPS unit and a clipboard and a pencil. So we are very excited to introduce, or not introduce, but say that we are going to be working on a smartphone application for data collection. So we're partnering with a group called EdMaps, and it stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, and they have made many, many smartphone applications. And this is a photograph of the one that we use here in New Jersey, the MAIDEN application. It stands for Mid-Atlantic Early Detection Network. And so what we're doing is we're partnering with this group to actually create a New Jersey-specific early detection system on the smartphone and tablets that everybody seems to be carrying around with them. So we're going to start working on that. This is actually what the funding for the NRCS grant is going to provide us for creating this this phone application. And then we're actually going to be working with Invasive Plant Control, who's hosting this phone call, to develop an additional application on management of these invasive species, so tracking eradications and herbicide application and all that kind of fun stuff. We're starting to work on this. It's a 2-year project, but we're hoping that in spring of 2014 that it will be available for free download and we can start training people on using. So what that allows volunteers to do, and land stewards, you know, you have your phone with you, which is basically a GPS unit, a camera, and a data sheet all in one. You can, you know, snap that picture and submit the data with the location all in one quick and easy step. We can receive it on our end, and then we can report it to the partner if it's a public property, and then we can also coordinate with EdMaps to get that information on the larger national database, and they have ways to download data and the reports. So it'll be a really great tool for, especially for our partners to be able to utilize. So we're really excited about that. This is what our map looks like on our website, and basically this is zoomed in to a specific property. On the right side of the map you can see, you can check county, municipality, property, or species. So you can actually, if you wanted to see where all the water chestnut in all of New Jersey, you would just select that under the species menu, and you can zoom in on any level. You can see the eradication information that's been done. And if you click on any one of these little bubbles, you can see who the person is that reported it. So there's a lot of information in there that is usable to our partners, and it's a very strong outreach tool. And also, we hope that eventually this might lead to some more legislation in New Jersey that bans some of these plants from being used in landscaping. So how can you get involved, especially those people that are here in New Jersey, or if you're off in other states and you are looking to form a cooperative weed management area? The public is basically our link to, to success. And so we encourage everybody that has any interest in invasive species to get involved. And the first way to do that is obviously to become a member. And that is a great benefit to us. It gives us little droplets of funding that add up to large pieces of activity that we can perform. Volunteers can also perform field work, and we try to link volunteers up with properties which are close by to them so that there's not a lot of driving involved. And a lot of our partners are now forming their own tiny little strike teams and task forces, and they're going out and they're following our methods. They're eradicating species, and then they report the data back to us. So you can volunteer local to your house. Reporting invasive species, which will be much easier once we have the smartphone app. But even right now, there's a way to report them through our website or just through email. If you see something that is one of our target species, or you're not sure if something is to be concerned about, you can send it over to us, and we keep all of that information and do with it what the best thing that needs to be done. Promoting the strike team, of course, and just going out and talking to people about invasive species and telling them about our organization. As I mentioned before, if you'd like to be an outreach volunteer, there's lots of community events across the state, and they're always interested in having us sit at the table and give out our little brochures. But that's a hard thing for us to accomplish too many of them, because they're always on the weekends and they often overlap. So if you'd like to be a volunteer for that, it doesn't require that much knowledge of invasive species, just a general background. Technical support, so people have made fact sheets for us. They've assisted us with our mapping and GIS software. They've made phone calls or done research if we've needed, so that's always very, very helpful. Fundraising, as I said, we raise all our own money. So if you know, if you're a fundraiser and you're good at writing grants, or you can help with that aspect, or you know a grantor that might be interested in our organization, that would be wonderful too. And then, of course, the best thing that people can do is really to work in your own backyard and really adopt your own property as your own private wildlife preserve, and realize that that does have incredible benefits. If everyone were to do that and recognize that they had that ability to provide food and shelter for wildlife, then we'd be in a really much better place in New Jersey. So I'll talk a little bit about that and how you can use your own backyard. And by backyard, it can mean a wildlife preserve as well. So it depends on what your perspective is. So the first thing we always encourage people to do is to stop purchasing invasive plants that are for sale. Our Do Not Plant list has about 115 plants on them, and I think over 105 of them are available for sale. And the only ones that are not are the ones that we recognize as being just, weeds like garlic mustard and things like that. But most of them are available for sale, and a large number of them are very commonly used, and I'll show some pictures of those in just a minute. These are things that's really easy. As you arm yourself with that information, you can just stop buying them and maybe educate your nursery on not selling them anymore. This photograph, this little purple Go Native photograph, is from, we have developed a little brochure, which again, you can either download from our website, or if you're in need, if you would like me to mail you a copy or a few copies, I would be happy to do that if you have some people or organizations that you want to distribute it to. It gives a little bit of education on why it's important to avoid invasive plants in the landscape and some of the native alternatives. So it's a great resource, especially for homeowners. The second step would be to start removing the current invasive plants from your property. And we're not just talking about those weedy things that everybody is willing to remove, but there's some things that people have actually planted and paid money for, or maybe you bought a house that had some invasive species planted. And we encourage you to consider removing them. Of course, there's no law, and we are not going to come out and tell you what to do. But as you become educated and understand the harm that invasive plants play, then we hope that eventually you'll start removing them from your landscape. And then, of course, the best thing, and the number 3 way that you can get involved, is to start growing plants that are native to New Jersey. We talk about removal, and this is both can be on a large scale through our land stewards, or on a small scale in your own backyard. The response and the removal is a little bit different depending on how large your scale is, but they're similar methods. There's basically 2 ways to remove invasive species. And the first one is manual control. So it's anything done with your hand. So it's pulling, it's weed wrenching, it's even things such as using mulch or weed fabric, and removing these plants so that they do not grow anymore. Now the problem on a large scale is that a lot of times when you're manually removing something, some small piece is left behind that you don't realize is still there in the ground or in the water, and it will regrow. So that picture on the right, the caption reads, "Untreated stump respreading vigorously." We might have cut that and left it there untreated, and now it's going to be that same shrub, just maybe even a little bit happier. So there are pros and cons to doing manual control, and the pro obviously is that you're not using any herbicides, so especially if you're in a sensitive area, such as a wetland or a place where there's endangered species. But the cons are that it's labor intensive and that things do resprout without us knowing it. So we always encourage people, if you're in a large scale setting where you're not necessarily going to be able to return to that exact individual spot, it's helpful to use herbicide and to use it wisely and ecologically, but that will help to make sure that that plant does not regrow. In your own backyard, it's certainly more acceptable to use strictly manual control. It's usually a smaller scale, something that you can return to. But even on that small scale, people have been pulling and pulling and pulling for many years. They may resort to some sort of chemical control as well. So chemical control being the second type of eradication method, and that's basically anything that involves using an herbicide. And they can be herbicide bought right from your local hardware store or bought over the internet in bulk quantities. What you want to look for when you're purchasing herbicide is the active ingredient. They come by all different trade names and brands. So what you want to look for is the active ingredient, and then you want to look for the concentration, and that will give you great information as far as how you should be using it and what habitat it's appropriate for. The three methods that the strike team uses most often and that we educate our partners on using, on the top right is called the cut stump method. So you'll see that that was a multi-stemmed shrub. We cut it down to the ground. You have to cut it parallel to the ground. And we applied an herbicide right there to that open exposed stump. And in this case, we did use a little bit of herbicide dye just to show us where we've been, but that doesn't have any other function except for just as an indicator. The herbicide is systemic, means it pulls down into the trunk of the plant, into the roots, and actually kills the roots, so preventing it from resprouting at all. So that's a great method because it is very local and specific. So people, especially that are a little bit leery about spraying, that method usually makes them most comfortable because you're really just kind of dripping it right on that open exposed stump. On the bottom left, the picture of the photograph, I should say, of the tree is a method called basal bark spraying. And basically that does not involve any manual control. You don't have to do any sort of cutting. You use an oil-based herbicide, which is a little different than the one you're using for the cut stump method. The oil helps the herbicide absorb directly into the bark and actually then translocates down to the roots and kills that tree in place. And we like that method, number one, because you don't have a lot of debris hanging around after the fact, whereas if you're doing the cut stump method, you end up with a lot of branches and debris. But the other reason the basal bark method is helpful because there are some species that are particularly clonal and aggressive. So if you cut them, they will start resprouting very, very quickly. And this method, the basal bark, kills the plant very slowly so that it doesn't have that flight response of sending out 100 extra little seedlings. And plants that do that, for example, are tree of heaven or Japanese Aurelia. Things that might send up, those are ones that are particularly clonal and send up all sorts of suckers. So we always recommend using the basal bark technique for those. The last method on the bottom right with the big red slash out is called the foliar spraying. And foliar, meaning leaf, basically means that you're spraying during the growing season and you're targeting the leaves. And the leaves are what absorbs the herbicide, pulls it into the roots, and then kills the plants. So a couple things to be wary about on foliar spraying. Do not spray over your head. So that's what that picture is showing you. The plant should be below your waist, and that reduces drift, which is when herbicide kind of blows away and might have impacts on non-target species. You also need to be aware of the species that you're treating. There are some species, such as the English ivy that we talked about very early on, that have a very waxy leaf covering. And certain herbicides cannot cut through that waxy leaf. So you'll be spraying and using a lot of chemical that's not going to do a whole lot of good. So you want to do a little research and make sure you're using the appropriate chemical so that you can use the least amount and be the most effective. But foliar spray is a nice eradication technique for things that are growing low on the ground, especially vines that are a little bit more difficult to control and find the stump or the stem. So that is a method that we use for those kinds of things. You do need a license here in New Jersey to spray on public property. You do not need a license to spray in your own backyard. So if you're interested in using herbicide in your own yard, it's perfectly legal. But I encourage you to do the research, follow the label, and make sure you know what you're spraying, both the species that you're treating and the herbicide that you're using for the safety of yourself and the environment. So what species are you going to be targeting? We'll talk specifically about plants. Backyard weeds, they're troublesome to many people, and they're confusing because a lot of the outreach tables that I sit at, people are talking about their backyard weeds and how they can control them. So these are 6 species here: garlic mustard, dandelion, stiltgrass, mugwort, ground ivy, and crabgrass. Those are very aggressive backyard weeds, things that are encroaching your lawn and your landscape beds. Only 3 of these are actually considered invasive. They're all 6 considered non-native, but 3 are considered invasive. And so I wanted to kind of put that out there, see if you can think about which ones you would think are invasive and which ones are not. And here is the answer. The 3 that are considered invasive species in New Jersey: garlic mustard, mugwort, and Japanese stiltgrass. The other 3, again, they're really what we'd consider a lawn weed, and the major difference is the impact on biodiversity, what I talked about when I very first started speaking. These plants, the garlic mustard, the mugwort, and the stiltgrass, are spreading from backyard properties into forests and into meadows, places that we want to have native plants and native animals, and they are impacting by suppressing some of those native plants. In your backyard, we're not that worried about them, unless, of course, you have a lovely native plant garden that it's impacting. The other 3, I'll put them back up there, they're really not having any impact on biodiversity. So while they might drive you crazy, if you're using a very small amount of chemical in your yard, I would encourage you to target the actual invasive species and leave alone the lawn weeds, and maybe try some hand pulling for those. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the landscape species that we present to anybody who's planting anything, whether you're planting in front of your house, in front of your office, or you're managing some of these infestations. It's important for people to understand what these species are. So this is purple loosestrife. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this plant. The insert on the left shows it planted in someone's yard, and lovely and manageable, and then the large picture shows what is happening when it spreads into a meadow, particularly for purple loosestrife, a wet meadow or a wetland type situation. And very clearly this picture shows that there are no other native plants that are able to grow alongside purple loosestrife. The animals that are relying on those native plants are pretty much out of luck. So we would be really concerned about this situation if it were to take place, which unfortunately it has in many cases. The next, and purple loosestrife, by the way, is considered a widespread invasive species, so when I talked about the difference between those. This next one is Callery pear or Bradford pear, sometimes called flowering pear. It's a lovely landscape plant. It's planted in all sorts of neighborhoods, and it makes a great street tree, I will say. It's small and compact and has a lovely white flower. That's the first thing to flower in the spring when we're just about getting spring fever. But then the large picture shows a meadow. Callery pear is a meadow invader. It needs a lot of sunlight. So in a situation where we used to get native pioneer species such as junipers and cherries, now we're getting these large patches of Callery pear. Moves very, very quickly because the birds tend to like the little tiny pears, and it's a real fast grower. So to go from meadow to this situation really only takes a handful of years, and then we have Callery pear and really nothing else going on along with it. Burning bush is another one of our widespread plants. So on the top left is a compact variety of it. It gets that beautiful red color, planted a lot in shopping centers. And the large picture is what it looks like when it gets into the forest understory. It's more of a pinkish wash to it. It doesn't get that bright, vibrant red color a lot of times once it's escaped. But picture this situation where you have these large trees and then all of this burning bush. If you were to have a situation such as a hurricane or a large windstorm or just trees dying of old age, you have no young trees that are coming in to replace them. So we'd get really apprehensive about what the future of our forests are when we see situations like this. Japanese and Chinese wisteria, another very popular landscape plant. It's on our emerging invasive plant list. And this picture is what it looks like when it starts to get into a forest. And you can see that wisteria can invade all levels of the forest. It can creep on the ground. It can kind of shrub up and serve as an understory shrub. And then in this picture especially, it's showing climbing these trees. wisteria can get a really thick vining stem that can basically girdle a tree. You can see some of these pictures at the bottom how it's wrapping around, and it can basically girdle and kill the mature tree. And the difficult part about wisteria is killing it. It's basically one large clone. You know, this whole scene is basically one plant. And so when you start to treat it, even with herbicide, you need to really treat it all at the same time. Otherwise, parts of it, you know, will continue to spread. And it does have a little bit of a waxy leaf. It's difficult to get through with some of the more mild herbicides. You need to add in some extra chemical to get through that waxy cuticle on the leaf. So once it escapes, it is very difficult to control. So I encourage anybody to either remove theirs or just please do not plant it anymore. Orange eye butterfly bush is one of our most controversial emerging invasive plants because of the fact that people think it does such a great service to wildlife. And that's true. The butterflies do feed on it, but it's pretty sugary, and it's pretty much equivalent to, you know, giving a preschool class a big box of Skittles. Yes, they are going to come, and yes, they're going to come back, but it's not necessarily the best choice for them. It doesn't provide any habitat or host food for the caterpillars, and it clearly invades through meadows. And we're concerned because of the impacts that it's having on the native species. And if you are interested in having butterflies in your yard, there's a whole selection of native pollinator plants that would be a much better choice than the butterfly bush. Okay, so just about through the talk. I wanted to bring up, these are a couple of great resources that I want to pass along in case you haven't read these books. The Brooklyn Botanic Garden has this Native Alternatives to Invasive Plants book, and that's great if you're looking for specific planting alternatives. Bringing Nature Home is one of the best books to get invigorated about planting natives. It really talks a lot about our food webs and the role that insects play in them and how your backyard really can become its own little wildlife preserve. And Plant Local is another great book just specifically about the great qualities of native plants. So if you're looking to learn more about what you should put in your yard, that has some really, really fantastic information and pictures. Our website, again, is www.njisst.org, and my email is down there. I encourage you to check out our website. Join us on our Facebook page, which we have blooming alerts during the season of what's growing, and we have invasive species in the news and all kinds of other information, and our outreach programs are on the Facebook page. We have a newsletter that goes out about once a month, and it talks about some of the great partner activities that our partners are doing, and then some of our events and activities. So if you want to join our newsletter, you can shoot me an email or you can join through our website. There's a little Contact Us button, and you can click Join Our Website. And then, of course, once our invasive species app is up and running, you'll be able to download that for free from the App Store and hopefully start collecting invasive species data. So that's it for me. I'll turn the phone back over to Steve in case anybody has submitted any questions.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. Good talk. It's good to see everything you guys are working on there. There are a few questions. You got a couple of questions were asked, and I think you answered them in the presentation. One about the mobile apps and their availability. Another question was, what do you recommend to remove English ivy? What are you guys doing for English ivy?
For English ivy, we usually recommend a glyphosate-based herbicide. Glyphosate would be the active ingredient in something like Roundup, but it goes under many trade names. Usually we recommend a slightly higher percentage, like a 5% solution, whereas most of the time for foliar spraying you're using a 2 to 3%. And what we've been recommended to use by some of our local contractors is to add in a surfactant. A surfactant is basically a soapy chemical that helps the herbicide stick to the leaves and bring it into the leaf. And the brand that we are recommended to use is called Clean Cut, and that apparently has a higher ability to get through that waxy cuticle. That's what we also use for wisteria. And so to mix those two together would be the recommendation for English ivy. It has been suggested that since English ivy is an evergreen, you might be able to treat it in the wintertime, so to avoid any non-native targets. but we're not sure how active the plant is photosynthesizing in the winter. I don't know, Steve, if you have any experience with that, but if you're spraying, I don't know how effective you are, in the winter, even though the plant is evergreen. But that's what we've been using, and we do have on our website, under the eradication drop-down menu, a whole spreadsheet called Recommended Treatment per Species. So basically it has the information on each of our target species and what our current recommendation is.
Great, and I'll throw in there that it's about a 50-50 shot when you treat it in the winter.
Okay.
It's not always effective, but sometimes it's 100% effective. So we recommend it. We recommend doing it when it's a little warmer during the growing season. But it is good. It is good in the winter if you're using volunteers or you have a workforce to have them go and cut the vines at the base of the trees during the winter. That's probably one of the more difficult parts about treating English ivy. And it's better to just do it when it's cooler and you can get people out there in that time of year. So,
great. Okay,
let's see. Another question. Hope you would address the growing problem with bamboo. Is it impossible to get rid of? Need assistance. So do you have any answers to that about bamboo? You guys work on that at all?
We don't work on bamboo. Bamboo is actually not on the our invasive plant list, and it seems to be missing from most. And it's really semantics. It's according to the definition of invasive plants, which are to say that they spread on their own via seed, and the bamboo does not produce a viable seed in New Jersey anyway. And so it sort of gets out of that definition of invasive species. That being said, clearly it is very aggressive. And clearly, if your property is abutting a nature preserve, it's going to spread on it. So it is something that we'd be concerned about. And I get a lot of emails from people saying their neighbors have it planted, and how can I control it? It's really difficult, and I don't know any success stories actually, except to say that it is a clonal species. So if, for instance, in a situation where your neighbor plants it and you're trying to kill yours, unless the parent population is killed, you will never be successful, because even through herbicide, you're going to kill that one stem. It's going to keep shooting over the rhizomes underground unless that parent is killed. I think if the parent population is attacked, I think you can just use a glyphosate solution. I don't think it's particularly hard to kill if you're amenable to using a foliar spray. But the problem is a lot of times that you can't get to that parent population because it's on somebody's property. That's what I hear the most. But no, I don't have any specific experience with it, except to know that that it is a spreading by rhizomes.
And I'll add that it is manageable, but exactly what you said. It's pretty much that's what it is. If your neighbor has it and they won't do anything about it, you can manage it on your side of the property. You can foliar spray it when it's small, or you can cut it and let it grow back and foliar spray it versus trying to get up in the top of it. Or you can cut it and treat the stump there by filling it with chemical. But I think cutting it and just spraying it when it comes back is good. So there are options for doing it, but you're right. If your neighbor has it and they're not willing to do anything about it. I will say this. There are states now where some lawsuits have actually been won about people's bamboo encroaching on other people's property, and then they won, and the neighbor does have to do something about it. I'd hate that it.
Yeah, actually, I just posted something. I just posted something on our Facebook page about some bamboo and neighbors, fighting back. So if you want to check out that link, that's up on our Facebook page.
Great, there you go. So how can ECs? I'm not sure what ECs mean. Reach to you.
Environmental Commission.
Okay. How can ECs reach to you for articles and links to place on local municipality websites?
How can they reach me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, the best thing is just email, and certainly do send me emails. I can add you to our newsletter list, and all. You can feel free to use our website and all the other resources. We do work specifically with environmental commissions, though. If you're interested, we do have a few that are members, and I've gone to environmental commission meetings to do a talk such as this, or something a little bit more pared down, whatever the need is. And we've done trainings with environmental commissions and work days. So it really depends on your town and how interested they want to get. As I mentioned, we're also working with some environmental commissions on developing ordinances. So there's lots and lots of ways for townships to get involved on that municipal level. So please do reach out to me and we can discuss the best fit for your town.
And the brief follow-up to that is they're looking for short stories to post. And just so everyone knows, I will be sending Melissa the questions and the answers that have been texted as well. So she'll have your question with your email and she'll be able to contact you afterwards. Another question just popped up. I find most groups are at a loss eradicating Japanese knotweed. Any suggestions?
Oh, Japanese knotweed is what we would call a widespread invasive species. So the first thing that we encourage landowners to do before starting to eradicate it is decide if it's even worth eradicating. And that sounds a little bit like a harsh statement because, you know, I used to think, well, of course we should control everything. But, you know, if you look at the entire state or the entire region that you're referencing, and to see the amount of Japanese knotweed, it would just be hopeless to start spraying it all or controlling it all. So what you want to do is hone in on areas that have high ecological value. So maybe in a high-value wetland, maybe on a nature preserve that you're using for educational uses, or something else that for the purposes of your control, you're being strategic about it. So that's the first thing is, if you're on a highway or you're in a power line right away, that maybe that can just stay the way that it is. You shouldn't waste necessarily all your time and resources on controlling, every bit of knotweed that you see. So that's the first recommendation. The second is, yes, there's been really successful control strategies. It's similar to bamboo. If you have access to it and you can control it and you have someone that's willing to spray it, the best method I've heard people recommend is to do a series of cutting through the growing season. So starting right in May and June, cut it down to the ground, cut it once, twice, maybe 3 times throughout the growing season. And what you're doing every time you cut it is you're weakening the roots. And then by the time it gets to this time of year, not only do you have weaker roots, but you have a smaller plant. It's going to keep growing back, but it'll be much smaller. And at that point, right before it freezes, you can do your foliar spraying at that point. And then once you spray it, because you have a weakened and smaller plant, you're much more successful than if you tried to spray it, in the middle of July when it was, 6 feet tall and in flower or whatever. So that's basically the recommendation. I've also heard people have success with the injection method where you use a syringe, but that obviously takes a huge amount of time because you have to inject each plant. But if you had a small population, that works very well. But cutting through the season and then spraying in the fall is basically the technique that we recommend to people.
Okay. Well, it looks like that is it for the questions today, and it looks like we're right at an hour, so I'll go ahead and close up. Again, if you guys have any questions, you should have Melissa's contact information. It's been up there for a while. Again, thank you for talking today and showing us everything you guys are working on. It's very nice. Thanks.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Anna. I
Okay.
look forward to hearing from some of you.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a good day. Bye.